It's estimated that between 60 to 65% of American soldiers stationed in the South Pacific during the Big Bad Global Conflict Part 2 suffered from a malarial infection at some point during their service. For some units, the infection proved to be more deadly than the enemy forces were, so finding an effective treatment was a high priority. Safe anti-malarial capsules were seen as essential to winning, or any kind of cure, honestly. Beginning in 1944 and spanning over the course of 2 years, more than 400 prisoners at the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois were subjects in an experiment aimed at finding an effective cure against malaria. Prisoners taking part in the experiment were infected with, well, malaria, and then treated with experimental treatments. The experiment didn't have a hidden agenda, and its unethical methodology didn't seem to bother the American public, who were eager to bring the troops home, safe and healthy. The intent of the experiments wasn't hidden from the subjects, who were at the time praised for their patriotism, and in many instances given shorter prison sentences in return for their participation. Ghostbuster Peter Venkman, who was seen in the fictional film conducting ESP electroshock experiments on college students, was likely inspired by social psychologist Stanley Milgram's famous series of shock experiments that were conducted in the early 1960s. During Milgram's experiments, teachers Americans recruited for a Yale study they thought was about memory and learning were told to read lists of words to learners, actors, although the teachers didn't know that. Each person in the teacher role was instructed to press a lever that would deliver a shock to their learner every time he made a mistake on word matching quizzes. Teachers believed the voltage of shocks increased with each mistake. It ranged from 15 to 450 possible volts. Roughly 2/3 of teachers shocked learners to the highest voltage, continuing to deliver jolts at the instruction of the experimenter. In reality, this wasn't an experiment about memory and learning. Rather, it was about how obedient we are to authority. No shocks were actually given. Now today, these shock experiments continue to be controversial. While they're criticized for their lack of realism, others point to the results as important to how humans behave when we're under duress. In 2010, the results of this study were repeated, with about 70% of teachers obediently administering what they believed to be the highest voltage shocks to their learners. There was a period in the CIA's history when they performed covert mind control experiments. If you thought this was fiction, sorry folks, it's real. During the Cold War, the CIA started researching ways they could turn Americans into CIA-controlled super agents. You know, folks who could carry out crimes and wouldn't be affected by enemy interrogations. Under what was known as the MK Ultra Project, CIA researchers experimented on unsuspecting American and Canadian citizens by slipping them psychedelics, we're talking hallucinogens and barbiturates and things I can't talk about, as well as additionally illegal methods such as hypnosis and possibly chemical, biological, and radiological agents. Universities participated, mostly as a delivery system, also sometimes without their knowledge. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs estimates 7,000 soldiers were also involved in the research without their consent. This project endured for more than 20 years, during which the agency spent about $20 million on it. There was at least one death tied to the project, although more were suspected. And in 1973, the CIA destroyed what records were kept. That sounds sus? Yes, it was. Using biological warfare was banned by the Geneva Protocol in 1925, but Japan said, yeah, no thanks, we're not going to follow that. If germ warfare was effective enough to be banned, it must work. Well, at least that's what the military leaders believed. Unit 731, a secret unit in a secret facility, publicly known as the Prevention and Water Supply Unit, was established in Japanese-controlled Manchuria, where by the mid-1930s, Japan began experimenting with pathogenic and chemical stuff and testing it on human subjects. Their military physicians and officers intentionally exposed victims to infectious diseases. We're talking the bubonic ickiness, cholera, syphilis, typhus, and other pathogens, in an effort to understand how they affected the body and how they could be used in explosives and attacks in that historical time period that we can't reference, but I'm referencing. In addition to working with pathogens, Unit 731 conducted experiments on people, including, but certainly not limited to, vivisections and dissections on living humans, all without anesthesia. Why? Well, they thought it would skew the results. We can't have that. Many of these subjects were civilians and prisoners of war, but also there was some international victims. We had some Americans, some Russians, basically anybody who, wasn't fine. Today, it's estimated that about 100,000 people were victims within the facility. But when you include the field experiments, we're talking like dropping some fleas that were infested with things over villages and poisoning wells, the death toll may be closer to 250,000 people. or more. Believe it or not, the US granted immunity to those involved in these crimes because, well, it was part of an information exchange agreement. And until the 1980s, the Japanese government refused to admit any of this ever happened. Ancient physician Herophilus is considered the father of anatomy, and while he made significant discoveries during his practice, it's how he learned about internal workings of the human body that lands him here today. So he practiced medicine in Alexandria, Egypt, and during the reign of the first two Ptolemies. So for about 30 years, and I think it was like 30 to 40 years, it was allowed to dissect human bodies, and this happened publicly. This was done alongside Greek physician and anatomist Erasistratus. Under Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, criminals could be sentenced to dissection and vivisection as punishment. And it's said the father of anatomy not only did that to the living and the dead, it did it to a lot of living. We're talking like 600 living prisoners. Herophilus made great strides in the study of human anatomy, especially the brain, eyes, liver, circulatory system, nervous system, and reproductive system. During a time in history when dissecting human cadavers was considered an act of desecration of the body, there were no autopsies conducted on the dead, even though mummification was popular. And don't worry folks, like today, doing this was considered inhumane. Dr. Albert Kligman, in collaboration with Dow Chemicals and the US Army, conducted a horrific medical experiment. This research was performed under the guise of dermatology research, but it was actually a study of the effects of Agent Orange on humans. So a lot of prisoners were injected with a byproduct known as dioxin. And aftermath of this, well, we had prisoners with volcanic eruptions of chloracne, so like intense acne, combined with cysts and so much more. This happened all over the armpits, nether regions, and the face. And even after the study was done, people were suffering from this for years. So there was one time in history when both the US and the Soviet Union were eager to discover whether or not the human body could survive a nuclear attack. So they tested this on people. From 1960 to 1971, Dr. Eugene Sagner, a radiologist, exposed more than 88 cancer patients to heavy amounts of radiation. These people were unaware that this experiment was being funded by the Pentagon, by the way. They were told it was a treatment that could maybe help cure them. They were exposed to radiation for an hour. Yeah, so then they had side effects like nausea, upchuck, mental confusion, and most folks died of radiation poisoning. Fear is a pretty universal emotion, right? But where does it come from? And what's it like to be truly fearless? So researchers tried to answer that first question in 2011 when they tested a human patient known anonymously as SM who did not experience fear. She had lesions on her amygdala. You know, the part of the brain that at the time they thought was the key to fear. They exposed her to scary stuff, snakes, spiders, haunted house, watched scary movies, and she felt no fear. And they're like, okay, that settles it, right? The amygdala is the key to the human fear response. Yeah, then fast forward 2013, some of the researchers tested SM again. This time though, they had her inhale something that would cause a feeling of not being able to breathe. So this time, SM did not stay calm. Instead, she had a panic attack, just like other subjects in the experiment, both of whom had damaged amygdalas. The findings made it clear that that's not the only part of the brain that processes fear. Fear is really a universal emotion. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, now Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Stanford University, set out to test the nature of human nature, to answer questions such as what happens when you put good people in evil situations. How he went about answering his human nature questions was and is thought by many to have been less than ethical. He set up a prison and paid college students to play guards and prisoners, who inevitably seemed to transform into harmful guards and hysterical prisoners. The 2-week experiment was shut down after just 6 days because things got chaotic too fast. In only a couple of days, the guards became like really bad. The prisoners were depressed, they were showing signs of extreme stress. The guards, pretty much from the get-go, treated the prisoners awfully, humiliating them by stripping them down to nothing, spraying them with delousing chemicals, and generally harassing and intimidating them. Well, turns out, according to a report from 2018, the guards didn't become aggressive on their own. Zimbardo encouraged the awful behavior, and some of the prisoners faked their emotional breakdowns. For instance, Douglas Corpy, a volunteer prisoner, said he faked it to get released early so he could study for an exam. Even so, this entire experiment has been the basis of psychologists and even historians' understanding of how even healthy people can become so evil when placed in certain situations, according to the American Psychological Association. In the 1960s and 70s, clinical psychologists led by Peter Newbar ran a secret experiment where they separated twins and triplets from each other and adopted them out as singlets. This experiment, said to have been partly funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, first came to light when 3 identical triplet brothers accidentally found each other in 1980. They had no idea they had siblings. So David Kellman, one of the triplets, felt anger. He was like, we were robbed of so many years together. And his brother, Edward Galland, died by taking his own life in 1995. So not really great for mental health. The psychiatrists who headed up the study, so Peter and Viola Bernard, showed no remorse. According to news reports, they went so far as saying they thought they were doing something good. They were separating these folks so they could develop their individual personalities. As for what Newbar learned from his secret evil experiment, that's anybody's guess. Turns out the results of this controversial study are being stored in an archive at Yale University, and they can't be unsealed until 2066. Well, that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya.